Feliz Instante Santo. Estamos aquí nuevamente para continuar con la lectura de un capítulo diario. Y hoy nos toca el capítulo 4. I'm sorry. Good morning, good afternoon. We're here to continue reading our text, complete and annotated edition. And we're going to read chapter 4. The ego struggle to preserve itself. Chapter 4 has 11 sections. The last foolish journey, the devoted teacher, the making of the ego's need to confirm itself, the calm being of God's kingdom. This need not be, the real question, the rewards of God, asking and following, complete and direct communication, being truly helpful. So we're going to start with chapter 4, the ego struggle to preserve itself. But before that, I'm going to give this submission to the Holy Spirit. I am here only to be truly helpful. I am here to represent Him who sent me. I do not have to worry about what to say or what to do because Him who sent me will direct me. I am content to be wherever He wishes, knowing that He goes there with me. I will heal as I let Him teach me how to heal. Okay. The ego struggle to preserve itself. Section 1. The last foolish journey. 1. The Bible says you should go with a brother twice as far as he asks. It certainly does not suggest that you set him back on his journey. Devotion to a brother cannot set you back either. It can only lead to mutual progress. The result of genuine devotion is inspiration, a word which, properly understood, is the opposite of fatigue. To be fatigued is to be dispirited. But to be inspired is to be in the spirit. To be egocentric, it is to be dispirited, but to be self-centered in the right sense is to be inspired, or in the spirit. The truly inspired are enlightened and cannot abide in darkness. 2. Do not attempt to break God's copyright. Do not attempt to break God's copyright because His authorship alone can copyright. Quote unquote. Your own right authorship does not lie in remarking His copies, but in creating like Him. Your own right authorship does not lie in remaking His copies, but in creating like Him. 3. Embarrassment is always an expression of egocentricity, an association which has been made before. If you complete the sentence stem, when I was called on to speak, quote unquote, with I became embarrassed and could not speak, quote unquote, this should be corrected to I recognize my authorship, quote unquote. You cannot be embarrassed by your own words unless you believe that you are responsible for them. We have already corrected word to thought, and you are free to allocate the authorship of your thoughts as you elect. You can thus speak from your spirit or from your ego, precisely as you choose. If you speak from your spirit, you have chosen to be still and know that I am God. These words are inspired because they come from knowledge. If you speak from your ego, you are disclaiming knowledge instead of affirming it, and are thus dispiriting yourself. Four, the dispirited have no choice but to be narcissistic. And to be narcissistic is to place your faith in the unworthy. Your real worth is your divine authorship, and your spirit is its acknowledgement. I cannot guide your mind except as you associate it with your spirit. 5. Attacking misidentification errors is neither my function nor yours. Destroying the devil is a meaningless undertaking. Cervantes wrote an excellent symbolic account of this procedure, though he did not understand his own symbolism. The real point of his writing was that his hero was a man who perceived himself as unworthy because he identified with his ego and perceived its weakness. He then set about to alter his misperception, not by correcting his misidentification, but by behaving egotistically. 6. Chesterton wrote an excellent description of Cervantes and his perception of his unheroic hero, a view of human beings which the ego tolerates all too frequently, but which the spirit never countenances. Countenances means the appearance of a person's face, a person's expression. The photograph showed his somber consequence. Visage. So countenances is visage. Okay. And he sees across a weary land a straggling road in Spain, up which a lean and foolish knight forever rides in vain. Oh, he's really okay. 7. Do not embark on foolish journeys, because they are indeed in vain. The ego may will them, because the ego is both lean and foolish, but the spirit cannot embark on them because it is forever unwilling to depart from its foundation. The journey to the cross should be the last foolish journey for your mind. Do not dwell upon it, but dismiss it as accomplished. If you can accept that as your own last foolish journey, you are free also to join my resurrection. 8. Human living has indeed been needlessly wasted in repetition compulsion. It reenacts the separation, the loss of power, the foolish journey of the ego in its attempts at reparation, and finally the crucifixion of the body or death. Repetition compulsions can be endless unless they are given up by an act of will, or more properly, an active creation. Do not make the pathetic human error of clinging to the old rugged cross. The only message of the crucifixion is in respect to your ability to overcome the cross. Unless you do so, you are free to crucify yourself as often as you choose. But this was not the gospel I intended to offer you. We have another journey to undertake, and I hope that if you will read these teachings carefully, they will help to prepare you to undertake it. Section 2. The Devoted Teacher. We have spoken of many different human symptoms, and at this level there is almost endless variation, but there is only one cause for all of them. The authority problem, not money, is the real root of all evil. Money is but one of its many reflections and is a reasonably representative example of the kind of thinking which stems from it. The idea of buying and selling implies precisely the kind of exchange that the spirit cannot understand at all, because its own supply is always abundant and all its demands are fully met. 2. Every symptom which the ego has made involves a contradiction in terms. This is because the mind is split between the ego and the spirit, so that whatever the ego makes is incomplete and contradictory. Consider, for example, what a speechless professor, quote unquote, means as a concept. It literally means a non professing professor, quote unquote, or a non speaking speaker, quote unquote. Untenable positions such as this are the result of the authority problem, which, because it accepts the one inconceivable thought as its premise, can only produce ideas which are inconceivable. 3. The term profess, quote unquote, is used in the Bible, but in a somewhat different context. To profess is to identify with an idea and offer the idea to others to be their own. The idea does not lessen thereby, it becomes stronger. The teacher clarifies his own ideas and strengthens them by teaching them. Teacher and pupil, therapist and patient are all alike in the learning process. They are in the same order of learning, and unless they share their lesson, they will lack conviction. If a salesman must believe in the products he sells, how much more if a salesman must believe in the product he sells, how much more must the teacher believe in the ideas which he professes? But he needs another condition. He must also believe in the students to whom he offers his ideas. 4. You could not be afraid to teach unless you still believe that interaction means loss and that learning means separation. You stand guard over your own ideas because you want to protect your thought system as it is, and learning means change. Change is always fearful to the separated because they cannot conceive of it as a change toward healing the separation. They always perceive it as a change toward future separation because separation was their first experience of change. 5. Your fear of teaching is nothing but an example of your own intense separation anxiety, which you have handled with the usual series of mixed defenses in the combined pattern of attack on truth and defense of error, which characterizes all ego thinking. You insist that if you allow no change to enter into your ego, your spirit will find peace. This profound confusion is possible only if one maintains that the same thought system can stand on two foundations. Nothing can reach the spirit from the ego, and nothing from the spirit can strengthen the ego or reduce the conflicts within it. The ego is a contradiction. Yourself and God's self are in opposition. They are opposed in origin, in will, and in outcome. They are fundamentally irreconcilable because the spirit cannot perceive and the ego cannot know. They are therefore not in communication and can never be in communication. 7. Nevertheless, the ego can learn because its maker can be misguided but cannot make the totally lifeless out of the life given. The spirit need not be taught, but the ego must. The ultimate lesson, the ultimate reason why learning of or teaching is perceived as frightening is because true learning does lead to the relinquishment, not destruction, of the ego to the light of the spirit. This is the change the ego must fear, because it does not share my charity. My lesson was like yours, and because I learned it, I can teach it. I never attack your ego, but I do try to teach how its thought system has arisen. When I remind you of your true creation, your ego cannot but respond with fear. 8. Teaching and learning are your greatest strengths now, because you must change your own mind and help others change theirs. It is pointless to refuse to tolerate change or changing because you believe that you can demonstrate by doing so that the separation never occurred. It is pointless to refuse to tolerate change or changing because you believe that you can demonstrate by doing so that the separation never occurred. The dreamer who doubts the reality of his dream while he is still dreaming, it is not really healing the level split. You have dreamed of a separated ego, and you have believed in a world which rests upon it. This is very real to you. You cannot undo this by doing nothing and not changing. If you are willing to renounce the role of guardian of your thought system and open it to me, I will correct it very gently and lead you home. 9. Every good teacher hopes to give his students so much of his own thinking that they will one day no longer need him. This is the one real goal of the parent, teacher, and therapist. This goal will not be achieved by those who believe that they will lose their child or pupil or patient if they succeed. It is impossible to convince the ego of this because it goes against all of its own laws. But remember that laws are set up to protect the continuity of the system in which the lawmaker believes. It is natural enough for the ego to try to perpetuate itself once you have made it. But it is not natural for you to want to obey its laws unless you believe in them. The ego cannot make this choice because of the nature of its origin, but you can because of the nature of yours. 10. Egos can clash in any situation, but souls cannot clash at all. If you perceive the teacher as merely a larger ego, quote unquote, you will be afraid because to enlarge an ego is to increase separation anxiety. Do not engage in this foolishness. I will teach with you and live with you if you will think with me. I will teach with you and live with you if you will think with me. But my goal will be always to absolve you, finally, from the need for a teacher. 11. This is the opposite of the ego-oriented teacher's goal. He is concerned with the effect of his ego on other egos, and he therefore interprets their interaction as a means of ego preservation. This is no less true if he is afraid to teach than if he is frankly out to dominate. The form of the symptom is only a reflection of his particular way of handling his separation anxiety. 12. All separation anxiety is a symptom of a continuing will to remain separated. This cannot be repeated too often because you have not learned it. You are afraid to teach only because you are afraid of the impression your image of yourself will make on other images. You believe that their approval of your image will exalt it, but that your separation Anxiety will increase. You also believe that their disapproval of it will lessen the anxiety, but at the cost of depression. 13. I would not be able to devote myself to teaching if I believed either of those blatant misperceptions, and you will not be a devoted teacher yourself as long as you maintain them. I am constantly being perceived as a teacher to be either exalted or rejected, but I do not accept either perception for myself. 14. Your worth is not established by your teaching. Your worth was established by God. As long as you dispute this, everything you do will be fearful, and particularly any situation which lends itself to the fallacy of superiority and inferiority. Teachers must be patient and repeat their lesson until they are learned. I am willing to do so because I have no right to set your learning limits for you. 15. So nice. Once again, nothing you do or think or will or make is necessary to establish your worth. This point is not debatable except in delusions. Your ego is never at stake because God did not create it. Your spirit is never at stake because He did. Any confusion on this point is a delusion, and no form of devotion is possible as long as this delusion lasts. 16. If you will to be a devoted teacher rather than an egocentric one, you will not be afraid. The teaching situation is fearful if it is misused as an ego involvement. If you become afraid, it is because you are using it this way. But the devoted teacher is perceiving the situation as it is and not as he wills it. He does not see it as dangerous because he is not exploiting it. 17. The ego tries to exploit those situations into forms of praise for itself to overcome its doubts. It will be doubtful forever, or better, as long as you believe in it. You who made it cannot trust it because you know it is not real. The only sane solution is not to try to change reality, which is indeed a fearful attempt, but to see it as it is. You are part of reality which stands unchanged beyond the reach of your ego, but within easy reach of your spirit. 18. Again, I tell you that when you are afraid, be still and know that God is real and you are. His beloved Son, in whom He is well pleased. Do not let your ego dispute this, because the ego cannot know what is as far beyond its reach as you are. God is not the author of fear. You are. You have willed, therefore, to create unlike Him, and have made fear for yourself. 19. You are not at peace because you are not fulfilling your function. God gave you a very lofty responsibility which you are not meeting. You know this, and you are afraid, but you have chosen to be afraid instead of meeting it. When you awaken your will, when you awaken, you will not be able to understand this because it is literally incredible. Do not believe the incredible now. Any attempt to enhance its believableness is merely to postpone the inevitable. The word inevitable, quote unquote, is fearful to the ego, but joyous to the spirit. God is inevitable, and you cannot avoid Him any more than He can avoid you. 20. The ego is afraid of the spirit's joy, because once you have experienced this, you will withdraw all protection from your ego and become totally without investment in fear. Your investment is great now, because fear is a witness to the separation, and your ego rejoices when you witness to it. Leave it behind. Do not listen to it and do not preserve it. Listen only to God, who is as incapable of deception as are the sons He created. As a teacher or therapist, release yourself and release others. Do not present a false and unworthy picture of yourself to others, nor accept such a picture of them to yourself. 21. The ego has built a shabby and unsheltering home for you because it cannot build otherwise. Do not try to make this impoverished house stand. Its weakness is your strength. Only God could make a home that was worthy of his creations, who have chosen to leave it empty by their own dispossession. But his home will stand forever and is ready for you when you choose to enter. Of this you can be wholly certain. God is as incapable of creating the perishable as your ego is of making the eternal. 22. Of your ego you can do nothing to save yourself or others, but of your spirit you can do everything for the salvation of both. Humility is a lesson for the ego, not for the spirit. The spirit is beyond humility because it recognizes its radiance and gladly sheds its light everywhere. The meek shall inherit the earth because their egos are humble, and this gives them better perception. But the kingdom of heaven is the right of the Spirit, whose beauty and dignity are beyond doubt, beyond perception, and stand forever as the mark of the love of God for his creations, who are wholly worthy of him and only of him. Nothing else is sufficiently worthy to be a gift for a creation of God himself. 23. I will substitute for your ego if you will, but never for your spirit. A father can safely leave a child with an elder brother who has shown himself responsible, but this involves no confusion about the child's origin. The brother can protect the child's body and his ego, which are very closely associated, but he does not confuse himself with the father because he does this, although the child may. 24. The reason why I can be entrusted with your body and your ego is simply because this enables you not to be concerned with them, and me to teach you their unimportance. I could not understand their importance to you if I had not once been tempted to believe in them myself. Let us undertake to learn this lesson together, so we can be free of them together. 25. I need devoted teachers. They heal the mind, and that is always my own aim. The spirit is far beyond the need of your protection or mine. The biblical quotation should read, in this world you need not have tribulation, because I have overcome the world. Quote unquote. In this world you need not have tribulation, because I have overcome the world. This is why you should be of good cheer. Section 3. The making of the ego. 1. You may ask how the mind could ever have made the ego. This is a perfectly reasonable question. In fact, the best question you could ask. There is no point in giving a historical answer because the past does not matter in human terms, and history would not exist if the same errors were not being repeated in the present. Your thinking is too abstract at times. Abstraction does apply to knowledge because knowledge is completely impersonal and examples are irrelevant to its understanding. Perception, however, is always specific and therefore quite concrete. Perceptual distortions are not abstractions, they are merely confusions. 2. Each person makes one ego for himself, although it is subject to enormous variation because of its instability. and one for everyone he perceives, which is equally variable. Their interaction is a process which literally alters both because they were not made either by or with the unalterable. It is particularly important to realize that this alteration can and does occur as readily when the interaction takes place in the mind as when it involves physical presence. Thinking about another ego is as effective in changing relative perception as is physical interaction. There could be no better example of the fact that the ego is an idea, though not a reality based thought. 3. The best concrete example you could have of how the mind could have made the ego is a person who has a great propensity for revelation but can suddenly swing to its complete opposite. Such a person does have real knowledge at times, but when she throws it away, it is as if she never had it. This willfulness is so apparent that you need only perceive it to see that it does happen. If it can occur that way in the present, why should you be surprised that it occurred that way in the past? All psychology rests on all psychology rests on the principle of continuity of behavior. Surprise is a reasonable response to the unfamiliar, but hardly to something that occurs with such persistence. 4. An extreme example is a good teaching aid, not because it is typical, but because it is clear. The more complex the material, the clearer the example should be for teaching purposes. But as we have said before, all good teaching devices in the hands of good teachers are aimed at rendering themselves unnecessary. I would therefore like to use the above person state as an example of how the mind can work, provided you fully recognize that it need not work that way. I never forget this myself, and a good teacher shares his own ideas in which he himself believes. Otherwise, he cannot really profess, quote unquote, them as we used the term before. 5. With full recognition of its transitory nature, a recognition which I hope you share, this person's state offers a very good teaching example of alternations between spirit and ego, with concomitant variations between peace and frenzy. In answer to the question above, it is perfectly apparent that when she is ego dominated, she does not know her spirit. As a result, she suffers from the intrusions of the ego, which is not her natural home, but not from complete lack of knowledge. Why are you surprised that something happened in the dim past when it can so clearly happen right now? 6. You forget the love which even animals have for their own offspring and the need they feel to protect them. This is because they regard them as part of themselves. No one disowns something he regards as a very real part of himself. You react to your ego much as God does to his sons, with love, protection, and great charity. Your reaction to the self you made is not at all surprising. In fact, it duplicates in many ways the way you will one day react to your real creations, which are as timeless as you are. 7. The question is not how you respond toward your ego, but only what you believe you are. Belief is an ego function, and as long as your origin is open to belief at all, You are regarding it from an ego viewpoint. This is why the Bible quotes me as saying, "Yea, believe in God, believe also in me," quote unquote. Belief does apply to me because I am the teacher of the ego. When teaching is no longer necessary, you will merely know God. Belief that there is another way is the loftiest idea of which ego thinking is capable. This is because it contains a hint of recognition that the ego is not the self. And I feel inspired to take a picture of this. Eight, undermining the foundation of an ego's thought system must be perceived as painful, even though this is anything but true. Babies scream in rage if you take away a knife or scissors, even though they may well harm themselves if you do not. In this sense, you are a baby. You have no sense of real self-preservation and are very likely to decide that you need precisely what would hurt you most. 9. Whether you know it now or not, however, you have will to cooperate in a concerted and very commendable effort to become both harmless and helpful, two attributes which must go together. Your attitudes, your attitudes, even towards this, are necessarily conflicted because all attitudes are ego-based. This will not last. Be patient a while and remember that we said once before, the outcome is as certain as God. Section 4. The ego's need to confirm itself. 1. Only those who have a real and lasting sense of abundance can be truly charitable. This is quite obvious when you consider the concepts involved. To be able to give anything implies that you can do it, that you can do without it. Even if you associate giving with sacrifice, you still give only because you believe you are somehow getting something better, so you can do without the thing you give. Giving to get, quote unquote, is an inescapable law of the ego, which always evaluates itself in relation to other egos and is therefore continually preoccupied with the scarcity principle which gave rise to it. 2. This is the meaning of Freud's pleasure principle. Freud was the most accurate ego psychologist we ever had. He was the most accurate ego psychologist we ever had, although he would not have preferred this description himself. His ego was a very weak and deprived concept, which could function only as a thing in need. The reality principle, quote unquote, of the ego is not real at all. The ego is forced to perceive the reality, quote unquote, of other egos because it cannot establish the reality of itself. In fact, its whole perception of other egos as real is only an attempt to convince itself that it is real. Three, self-esteem, self-esteem, quote unquote, in ego terms, means nothing more than that the ego has deluded itself into accepting its reality and is therefore temporarily less predatory. This self-esteem is always vulnerable to stress, quote unquote, a term which really means that a condition has arisen in which the delusion of the ego's reality is threatened. This produces either ego deflation or ego inflation, resulting in withdrawal or attack. The ego literally lives by comparisons. This means that equality is beyond its grasp and charity becomes impossible. The ego never gives out of abundance because it was made as a substitute for it. Wow. This is why the concept of getting arose in the ego's thought system. 4. All appetites are getting quote unquote mechanisms representing ego needs to confirm itself. This is as true of bodily appetites as it is of the so-called higher ego needs. Bodily appetites are not physical in origin because the ego regards the body as its home and does try to satisfy itself through it. But the idea that this is possible is a decision of the ego, which is completely confused about what is really possible. This accounts for its essentially erratic nature. 5. Consider the inevitable confusion which must arise from a perception of the self which completes the sentence stem. When I was completely on my own, quote unquote, with I had no idea what was possible, quote unquote. The ego does believe it is completely on its own, which is merely another way of describing how it originated. This is such a fearful state that it can only turn to other egos and unite with them in a feeble attempt at identification or attack them in an equally feeble show of strength. The ego is free to complete the stem when I was completely on my own, quote unquote, in any way it chooses, but it is not free to consider the validity of the premise itself, because this premise is its foundation. The ego is the belief of the mind that it is completely on its own. Okay. 6. The ego's ceaseless attempts to gain the spirit's acknowledgement and thus really establish its own existence are utterly useless. The spirit, in its knowledge, is unaware of the ego. It does not attack the ego, it merely cannot conceive of it at all. While the ego is equally unaware of the spirit, it does perceive itself as rejected by something which is greater than itself. This is why self-esteem in ego terms must be a delusion. 7. The creations of God do not create myths, but the creative efforts of human beings can turn to mythology, under one condition only. What they then make is no longer creative. Myths are entirely perceptions and are so ambivalent in form and so characteristically good and evil in nature that the most benevolent of them is not without fearful components, if only in innuendo. Myths and magic are related in that myths are usually related to the ego's origins and magic to the powers which it ascribes to itself. Every mythological system includes an account of the creation and associates this with its particular perception of magic. The battle for survival is merely the ego's struggle to preserve itself and its interpretation of its beginning. 8. This beginning is always associated with physical birth because nobody maintains that the ego existed before that point in time. The religiously ego-oriented tend to believe that the soul existed before and will continue to exist afterwards, after a temporary lapse into ego life. Some actually believe that the soul will be punished for this lapse, even though in reality it could not possibly know anything about it. 9. The term salvation, quote unquote, does not apply to the soul, the spirit, when is in no danger and does not need to be salvaged or saved. Salvation is nothing more than right-mindedness. Salvation is right-mindedness, which is not the one-mindedness of the spirit, but which must be accomplished before one-mindedness can be restored. Right-mindedness dictates the next step automatically because right perception is uniformly without attack, so that wrong-mindedness is obliterated. The ego cannot survive without judgment and is laid aside accordingly. Wow. The ego cannot survive without judgment and is laid aside accordingly. The mind then has only one direction in which it can move. 10. The directions which the mind will take are always automatic because they cannot but be dictated by the thought system to which it adheres. Every thought system has internal consistency, and this does provide a basis for the continuity of behavior. However, reliable behavior does not mean valid behavior. Reliable behavior is a meaningful perception as far as ego thinking goes. However, valid behavior is an expression which is inherently contradictory because validity is an end and behavior is a means. These cannot be combined logically because when an end has been attained, the means for its attainment are no longer meaningful. 11. Whereas the validity of a psychological test can be judged in different ways, by logic, by theory, and by practice, and in each case assigned a different amount of confidence, a hypothesis is tested as either true or false to be accepted or rejected accordingly. If it is shown to be true, it becomes a fact, after which no one attempts to evaluate it unless its status as fact is questioned. 12. Every idea which the ego has accorded the status of fact is questionable, because facts are in the realm of knowledge. Confusing realms of discourse is a thinking error which philosophers have recognized for centuries. Psychologists are generally quite deficient in this respect, as are many theologians. Data from one realm of discourse do not mean anything in another, because they can be understood only within the thought system of which they are a part. This is why psychologists are concentrating increasingly on the ego in an attempt to unify their clearly unrelated data. It need hardly be said that any attempt to relate the unrelated cannot succeed. The recent ecological emphasis is but a more ingenious way of trying to impose order on chaos. 13. We have already credited the ego with considerable ingenuity, though not with true creativity, with true creativeness. But it should always be remembered that uninventiveness is really wasted effort, even in its most ingenious forms. We do not have to explain anything. This is why we need not trouble ourselves with inventiveness. The highly specific nature of invention is not worthy of the abstract creativity of God's creations. Section 5. The calm being of God's kingdom. 1. It is difficult to understand what the kingdom of heaven is within you, quote unquote, means. The reason is because it is not understandable to the ego, which interprets it as if something outside is inside, which does not mean anything. The word within, quote unquote, does not belong. The kingdom of heaven is you. What else but you did the Creator create? And what else but you is His kingdom? This is the whole message of the atonement, a message which in its totality transcends the sum of the parts, as we said about the sonship before. 2. Christmas is not a time, it is a state of mind. The Christ mind wills from the Spirit, not from the ego, and the Christ mind is yours. You too have a kingdom which your spirit has created. It has not ceased to create because your ego has set you on the road of perception. Your spirit's creations are no more fatherless than you are. Your ego and your spirit will never be co-creators, but your spirit and your creator will always be. Be confident that your creations are as safe as you are. The kingdom is perfectly united and perfectly protected, and the ego would not prevail against it. Amen. The kingdom is perfectly united and perfectly protected, and the ego will not prevail against it. Amen. The kingdom is perfectly united and perfectly protected, and the ego will not prevail against it. Amen. That was written in the form of a prayer because it is a good thing to use in moments of temptation. It is a declaration of independence. You will find it very helpful if you understand it fully. 3. It is characteristic. In its characteristic upside down way, the ego has taken the impulses from the superconscious and perceived them as if they arise in the unconscious. The ego judges what is to be accepted, and the impulses from the superconscious are essentially unacceptable to it because they clearly point to the non-existence of the ego itself. When this occurs, the ego experiences threats and not only censors but reinterprets the data. However, as Freud very correctly pointed out, what you do not perceive you still know, and it can retain a very active life beyond your awareness. 4. Repression thus operates to conceal not only the baser impulses, but also the most lofty ones from the ego's awareness, because both are threatening to the ego, and being concerned primarily with its own preservation in the face of threat, it perceives them as the same. The threat value of the lofty is really much greater to the ego, because the pull of God himself can hardly be equated with the pull of human appetites. By perceiving them as the same, the ego attempts to save itself from being swept away as it surely would be in the presence of knowledge. 5. The upper level of the unconscious thus contains the call of God as well as the call of the body. That is why the basic conflict between love and fear is unconscious. The ego cannot tolerate either and represses both by resorting to inhibition. Society depends on inhibiting the latter, but salvation depends on disinhibiting the former. 6. The reason you need my help is because you have repressed your own guide. And therefore need guidance. My role is to separate the true from the false in your own unconscious, so truth can break through the barriers the ego has set up and shine into your mind. Against our united strength, the ego cannot prevail. 7. It should be quite apparent to you by now why the ego regards the spirit as its enemy. The ego arose from the separation, and its continued existence depends on a continuing belief in the separation. Reducing the spirit impulses to the unconscious, the ego has to offer you some sort of reward for maintaining this belief. All it can offer in view of its own weakness is a sense of temporary existence, which begins with its own beginning and ends with its own ending. It tells you that this life is your existence because it is its own. 8. Against this sense of temporary existence, the spirit offers the knowledge of permanent and unshakable being. No one who has experienced the revelation of this can ever fully believe in the ego again. How can its meager offerings to you prevail against the glorious gift of God? 9. You, who are identified with your ego, cannot believe that God loves you. You do not love what you have made, and what you have made does not love you. Egos are concerned with self-protection, not with love. Being made out of denial of the Father, they have no allegiance to their own Maker. You cannot conceive of the true relationship that exists between God and His sons because of the hatred you have for the self you have made. You project onto your own idea of yourself the will to separate. Which conflicts with the love you also feel for what you made. 10. No human love is without this ambivalence, and since no ego has experienced love without ambivalence, the concept is beyond its understanding. Love will enter immediately into any mind which truly wants it, but it must want it truly. And this means that it wants it without ambivalence. This kind of wanting is wholly without the ego's drive to get. 11. There is a kind of experience that is so different from anything the ego can offer that you will never recover. The word is quite literal here. You will never hide again. It is necessary to repeat that your belief in darkness and in hiding is why the light cannot enter. The Bible has many references to the immeasurable gifts which are for you, but for which you must ask. This is not a condition as the ego sets conditions. It is the glorious condition of what you are. No force except your own will is strong enough or worthy enough to guide you. In this you are as free as God and must remain so forever. You can never be bound except in honor, and that is always voluntary. 12. Let us ask the Father in my name to keep your mind full. Let us ask the Father in my name to keep you mindful of His love for you and yours for Him. He has never failed to answer this request because it asks only for what He has already willed. Those who call truly are always answered. If you become fearful at this, remember, thou shalt have no other gods before me, quote unquote, because there are none. You still think there are. 13. It has never really entered your mind to give up every idea you have ever had that opposes knowledge. You retain thousands of little scraps of meanness which prevent the Holy One from entering. Light cannot penetrate through the walls you make to block it, and it is forever unwilling to destroy what you have made. No one can see through a wall, but I can step around it. 14. Watch your mind for the scraps of meanness, or you will be unable to ask me to do so. Watch your mind for the scraps of meanness, or you will be unable to ask me to do so. I can help you only as our Father created us. I will love you and honor you and maintain complete respect for what you have made. But I will neither love not nor honor it unless it is true. Ask me truly, and I will come. Do not ask me truly, and I will wait. I will never forsake you any more than God will, but I must wait as long as you will to forsake yourself. Because I wait in love and not in impatience, you will surely ask me truly. I will come gladly in response to a single unequivocal call. 15. Watch carefully and see what it is you. Watch carefully and see what it is you are truly asking for. Be very honest with yourself about this. Excuse me. For we must hide nothing from each other. If you will really try to do this, you have taken the first step toward preparing your mind for the Holy One to enter. We will prepare for this together, and once he has come, you will be ready to help me make another mind ready for him. How long will you deny him his kingdom? 16. In your own unconscious, deeply repressed by the ego, is the declaration of your release. God has given you everything. This is the one fact, which means that the ego does not exist, and which therefore makes it profoundly afraid. In the ego's language, to have and to be are different, but they are identical to the spirit. It knows that you both have and are everything. Any distinction in this respect is meaningful only when the idea of getting, which implies a lack, has already been accepted. That is why we made no distinction before between having the kingdom of God and being the kingdom of God. 17. The calm being of God's kingdom, which in your sane mind is perfectly conscious, is ruthlessly banished from the part of the mind which the ego rules. The ego is desperate because it opposes literally invincible odds, whether you are asleep or awake. Consider how much vigilance you have been willing to exert to protect your ego, and how little you have been willing to expand to protect your higher mind. And how little you have been willing to expend to protect your higher mind. Who but the insane would undertake to believe in what is not true and then protect this belief at the cost of truth? Section 6. This need not be. And I'm going to just step out a minute and I'll be back. Thank you. 6. This needs not be. If you cannot hear the voice of God, it is because you do not choose to listen. The fact that you do listen to the voice of your ego is demonstrated by your attitudes, your feelings, and your behavior. Your attitudes are obviously conflicted. Your feelings have a narrow range of variation on the negative side, but are never purely joyous. And your behavior is either strained or unpredictable. Felicitante Santo Santa Lisbeth. Yet this is what you want. This is what you are fighting to keep and what you are vigilant to save. Your mind is filled with schemes to save the face of your ego, and you do not seek the face of God. 2. Excuse me. The glass in which the ego seeks to see its face is dark indeed. How can it maintain the trick of its existence except with mirrors? How can it maintain the trick of its existence except with mirrors? But where you look to find yourself is up to you. But where you look to find yourself is up to you. We have said that you cannot change your mind by changing your behavior, but we have also said, and many times before, that you can change your mind. 3. When your mood tells you that you have willed wrongly, and this is so whenever you are not joyous, then no, this needs not be. In every case, you have thought wrongly about some brother that God created and are perceiving images your ego makes in a darkened glass. Think honestly what you have thought that God would not have thought, and what you have not thought that God would have you think. Search sincerely for what you have done and left undone accordingly, and then change your mind to think with God's. 4. This may seem hard to you, but it is much easier than trying to think against it. Your mind is one with God's. Denying this and thinking otherwise has held your ego together, but has literally split your mind. Se me inspira tomar una foto de esta parte que acabo de leer. This may seem hard to you, but it is much easier than trying to think against it. Your mind is one with God's. Denying this and thinking otherwise has held your ego together, but has literally split your mind. As a loving brother, I am deeply concerned with your mind and urge you to follow my example as you look at yourself and at your brother and see in both the glorious creations of a glorious God, Father. When you are sad, no, this needs not be. Depression is of the ego, and you are hiding little spots of hatred that are hurting you. Depression always arises ultimately from a sense of being deprived of something you want and do not have. No, you are deprived of nothing except by your own decisions, and then decide otherwise. 6. When you are anxious, know that all anxiety comes from the capriciousness of the ego and need not be. You can be as vigilant against the ego's dictates as for them. 7. When you feel guilty, know that your ego has indeed violated the laws of God, but you have not. Leave the sins to the ego. Leave the sins of the ego to me. That is what the atonement is for. But until you change your mind about those your ego has hurt, the atonement cannot release you. As long as you feel guilty, your ego is in command. Because only the ego can experience guilt. This needs not be. 8. Be honest in trying to see whom your ego has hurt, and also in trying to change your mind about them. I am not unmindful of your efforts in this direction, but you still have too much energy invested in your ego. This needs not be. Watch your mind for the temptations of the ego and do not be deceived by it. No, it offers you nothing. 9. Those with a habit of disengagement often do not make consistent efforts to change their minds except through applying their old habit pattern to these new ideas. Even then, however, they can learn that the mind gains control over itself when they direct it genuinely toward perceiving something else truly. Their lack of vitality is due to their efforts at solving their needless depression and anxiety through disinterest. Because their egos were protected by this unfortunate negative attitude, they are afraid to abandon it. When they exert real efforts to give up this voluntary dispiriting, they will see how their minds can focus and rise above fatigue and heal. When they exert real effort to give up this voluntary dispiriting, they will see how their minds can focus and rise above fatigue and heal. But they are not sufficiently vigilant against their ego's demand to disengage themselves. This needs not be. 10. The new habit of engaging with God and His creations is easily made if you actively refuse to let your mind slip away. Your problem is not concentration, it is a belief that nobody, including yourself, is worth consistent effort. Side with me consistently against this deception. Do not permit this shabby belief to pull you back. The disheartened are useless to themselves and to me, but only the ego can be disheartened. 11. Have you really considered how many opportunities you have to gladden yourself and how many of them you have refused? There is no limit to the power of a Son of God, but He Himself can limit the expression of His power as much as He wills. Your mind and mind can unite in shining your ego away and releasing the strength and beauty of God into everything you think and will and do. Do not settle for anything less than this and refuse to accept anything but this as your goal. Watch your mind carefully for any beliefs that hinder its accomplishment and step away from them. 12. Judge how well you have done this by your own feelings, for this is the only right use of judgment. Judgment, like any other defense, can be used to attack or protect, to hurt or to heal. The ego should be brought to your own judgment and be found wanting there. Without your own allegiance, protection, and love, it cannot exist. Judge your ego truly, and you must withdraw allegiance, protection, and love from it. 13. You are a mirror of truth in which God Himself shines in perfect clarity. To the ego's dark glass, you need but say, I will not look there because I know these images are not true. I will not look there because I know these images are not true. I will not look there because I know these images are not true. Then let the Holy One shine upon you in peace, knowing that this and only this must be. His mind shone on you in your creation and brought your mind into being. His mind still shines on you and must shine through you. Your ego cannot prevent Him from shining upon you, but it can prevent you from letting Him shine through you. 14. The first coming of Christ is just another name for the creation because Christ is the Son of God. The second coming of Christ means nothing more than the end of the ego's rule over part of the minds of men and the healing of the mind. I was created like you in the first, and I am reminding you that I have called you to join with me in the second. 15. If you will think over your life, you will see how carefully the preparations were made. I am in charge of the second coming, as I already told you, and my judgment, which is used only for its protection, cannot be wrong because it never attacks. Yours is so distorted that you believe that I was mistaken in choosing you. I assure you this is a mistake of your own ego. Do not mistake it for humility. Your ego is trying to convince you that it is real and that I am not, because if I am real, I am no more real than you are. That knowledge, and I assure you that that is knowledge, means that Christ has come into your mind and healed it. 16. I am not attacking your ego, but I am working with your higher mind, whether you sleep or awake, just as your ego does with your lower mind. I am your vigilance in this, because you are too confused to recognize your own hope. I was not mistaken. Your mind will elect to join with mine, and together we are invincible. You and your brother will yet come together in my name, and your sanity will be restored. 17. I raise the dead by knowing that life is an eternal attribute of everything the living God created. Why do you believe that it is harder for me to inspire the dispirited or to stabilize the unstable? I do not believe that there is an order of difficulty in miracles. You do. I have called you and you will answer. I know that miracles are natural because they are expressions of love. My calling you is as natural as your answer and as inevitable. Thank you. Estaba perdonando porque tengo una aparente fatiga y eso es del ego. Entonces le estoy entregando esa transmisión al Espíritu Santo. Porque esto no tiene por qué ser así. This needs not be. 8. 7. The real question, la verdadera pregunta. All things work together for good. There are no exceptions except in the ego's judgment. The ego resents everything it does not control. Control is a central factor in what the ego permits into unconsciousness, and one to it devotes its maximum vigilance. This is not the way a balanced mind holds together, as its control is unconscious. 2. The ego stays father of balance by keeping its primary motivation unconscious and raising control rather than sensible judgment to predominance. It has every reason to do this according to the thought system which both gave rise to it and which it serves. Sane judgment would inevitably judge against it and must be obliterated by the ego in the interest of its self-preservation. 3. A crucial source of the ego's off-balance state is its lack of discrimination between impulses from God and from the body. Any thought system which makes this confusion must be insane. Yet this demented state is essential to the ego, which judges only in terms of threat or non-threat to itself. 4. In other sense, the ego's fear of the idea of God is at least logical, because this idea does dispel it. Fear of dissolution from the higher source then makes some sense in ego terms. But fear of the body, with which the ego identifies so closely, is more blatantly senseless. The body is the ego's home by its own election. It is the only identification with which it feels safe, because the body's vulnerability is its own best argument that you cannot be of God. 5. This is the belief that it sponsors eagerly. Yet the ego hates the body because it does not accept the idea that the body is good enough as its home. Here is where the mind becomes actually dazed. Being told by the ego that it is really part of the body and that the body is its protector, it is also constantly informed that the body cannot protect it. This, of course, is not only true but perfectly obvious. 6. Therefore, the mind asks, where can I go for protection? To which the ego replies, turn to me. Quote unquote. The mind, and not without cause, reminds the ego that it has itself insisted that it is identified with the body, so there is no point in turning to it for protection. The ego has no real answer to this because there isn't any, but it does have a typical solution. It obliterates the question from the mind's awareness. Once unconscious, it can and does produce uneasiness, but it cannot be answered because it cannot be asked. 7. This is the question which must be asked. Where can I go for protection? Only an insane mind fails to ask it. Even the insane ask it unconsciously, but it requires real sanity to ask it consciously. The real problem is correctly stated as, what is the question? Because the answer can be found if the question is recognized. If it is not, you will attempt a number of solutions, all ego-based, not because you think they will really work, but because the question itself is obscure. 8. When the Bible says, seek and you shall find, quote unquote, it does not mean that you should seek blindly and desperately for something you wouldn't recognize. Meaningful seeking is consciously undertaken, consciously organized, and consciously directed. The goal must be formulated clearly and kept in mind. Many are not good at doing this. They still search for many gods simultaneously, and this goal confusion, especially given a very strong will, must produce chaotic behavior. 9. Others have behavior that is not chaotic because they are not so much goal divided as not goal oriented. Where the first kind have overinvested in many goals, the second kind have underinvested in all goals. They have the advantage of potentially greater freedom from distractibility, but they do not always care enough to use it. The first kind have the advantage of exerting great effort, but they keep losing sight of the goal. 10. It would be very intelligent of you to set yourself the goal of really studying for this course. There can be no doubt of the wisdom in this decision for any student who wants to pass it. But knowing your individual weaknesses as the learner and being a teacher with some experience, I must remind you that learning and wanting to learn are inseparable. All learners learn best when they believe what they are trying to learn is of value to them. But values in this world are hierarchical. Excuse me. and not everything you may want to learn has lasting value. Indeed, many of the things you want to learn are chosen because their value will not last. The ego thinks it is an advantage not to commit itself to anything that is eternal, because the eternal must come from God. 11. Eternalness is the one function that the ego has tried to develop but has systematically failed to achieve. It may surprise you to learn that the ego will to do so. It, it could have made the eternal because, as a product of the mind, it is endowed with the power of its own maker. But the decision to do this rather than the ability to do it is what the ego cannot tolerate. That is because the decision from which the ability would naturally develop would necessarily involve true perception, a state of clarity with which the ego, fearful of being judged truly, must avoid. 12. The results of this seeming dilemma are peculiar, but no more so than the dilemma itself. The ego has reacted characteristically here as elsewhere, because mental illness, which is always from a form of ego involvement, is not a problem of reliability as much as of validity. The ego compromises with the issue of the eternal, just as it does with all issues that touch on the real question in any way. By compromising in connection with all tangential questions, it hopes to hide the real question and keep it out of mind. Its characteristic busyness with non-essentials is precisely for that purpose. 13. Consider the alchemist's age-old attempts to turn base metal into gold. The one question which the alchemist did not permit himself to ask was, "What for?" He could not ask this because it would have immediately become apparent that there was no sense of his errors, even if he succeeded. The ego has also countenanced some strange compromises with the idea of the eternal, making odd attempts to relate the concept to the unimportant in an effort to satisfy the mind without jeopardizing itself. Thus, it has permitted many good minds to devote themselves to perpetual motion, but not to perpetual or eternal thoughts. Ideational preoccupations with conceptual problems set up to be incapable of solution are another favorite ego device for impeding the strong-willed from real progress in learning. The problems of squaring the circle and carrying pi to infinity are good examples. A more recent ego attempt is particularly noteworthy. The idea of preserving the body by suspension, thus giving it the kind of limited immortality which the ego can tolerate, is among its most recent appeals to the mind. 16. It is noticeable that in all these diversionary tactics, the one question which is never asked by those who pursue them is, "What for?" This is the question which you must learn to ask in connection with everything your mind wills to undertake. What is your purpose? Whatever it is, you cannot doubt that it will channelize your efforts automatically. When you make a decision of purpose, then you have made a decision about future effort, a decision which will remain in effect unless you change the decision. 17. Psychologists are in a good position to realize that the ego is capable of making and accepting as real some very distorted associations which are not true. The confusion of sex with aggression, and resulting behavior, which is the same for both, is a good example. This is understandable to the psychologist and does not produce surprise. The lack of surprise, however, is not a sign of understanding. It is a symptom of the psychologist's ability to accept as reasonable a compromise which is clearly senseless, to attribute it to the mental illness of the patient rather than his own, and to limit his question about both the patient and himself to the trivial. These relatively minor confusions of the ego are not among its more profound misassociations, although they do reflect them. Paragraph 19. Your own ego has been blocking the more important question which your mind should ask. You do not understand a patient while you yourself are willing to limit the questions you raise about his mind because you are also accepting these limits for yours. This makes you unable to heal him as yourself. Be always willing to adapt to any situation in which miracle-mindedness is unthinkable. That state in itself is enough to demonstrate that perception is wrong. End of section 7. And we will continue with section 8. The rewards of God. Oh, but just let me do something. The rewards of God. Section 4. It cannot be emphasized too often that correcting perception is merely a temporary experience. It is necessary only because misperception is a block to knowledge, while accurate perception is a stepping stone toward it. The whole value of right perception lies in the inevitable judgment which it necessarily entails, that it itself is unnecessary. This removes the block entirely. 2. You may ask how this is possible as long as you appear to be living in this world. And since this is a sensible question, it has a sensible answer. But you must be careful that you really understand the question. What is the you who are living in this world? You may have trouble with this, but if you will try not to close your mind, you may decide that we are not engaging in denial after all. 3. To help you, it might be wise for you to review some related concepts with which you do not appear to have trouble. You may, for instance, like the idea of invisible realities or be particularly open to the concept of different orders of reality. You may also find the notion of varying densities of energy appealing. While these are merely teaching aids, these this might be a good time to employ them. 4. Immortality is a consistent state. It is as true now as it ever was or will be, because it implies no change at all. It is not a continuum, and it is not understood by comparing it with an opposite. Knowledge never involves comparisons. This is its essential difference from everything else the mind can grasp. 5. A little knowledge, quote unquote, is not dangerous except to the ego. Vaguely, the ego senses threats, and being unable to realize that a little knowledge is a meaningless phrase because all and little, all and a little in this context are the same. decides that since all quote unquote is impossible, the fear does not lie there. A little, however, is a scarcity concept, and this the ego understands well. Regarding all as impossible, a little is perceived as the real threat. 6. The essential thing to remember always is that the ego does not recognize the source, the real source of its perceived threat. And if you associate yourself with your ego, you do not perceive the whole situation as it really is. Only your allegiance to it gives the ego any power over you. We have spoken of the ego as if it were a separate thing, acting on its own. This was necessary to persuade you that you cannot dismiss it lightly, and must realize how much of your thinking is ego directed. But we cannot safely leave it as at that, as you will regard yourself as necessarily conflicted as long as you are here, or more properly, believe that you are here. 7. We believe that we are here. The ego is nothing more than a part of your belief about yourself. The ego is nothing more than a part of your belief about yourself. Your other life has continued without interruption and has been and always will be totally unaffected by your attempts to dissociate. The ratio of repression and dissociation of truth varies with the individual ego illusion, but dissociation is always involved, or you could not believe that you are here. 8. When I told you to concentrate on the phrase, "Here I am, Lord," I did not mean in this world, but here. I wanted you to think of yourself as a distinct consciousness, capable of direct communication with the Creator of that consciousness. You must begin to think of yourself as a very powerful receiving and sending channel. Nine. Your great debt to your brother is something you should never forget. It is exactly the same debt that you owe me. Whenever you react egotistically toward your brother, you are throwing away the graciousness of your indebtedness at the holy perception it would produce. The reason why the term holy can be used here is that as you learn how much you are indebted in the whole sonship, which includes me, you come as close to the kingdom as perception ever can. This gap is so small to knowledge, is so small, knowledge can easily flow across it and obliterate it forever. 10. You have very little trust in me as yet, but it will increase as you turn more and more often to me instead of to your ego for guidance. The results will convince you increasingly that your choice is turning to me. The results will convince you increasingly that your choice in turning to me is the only sane one you can make. No one who has learned from experience that one choice brings peace and joy while another brings chaos and disaster needs much conditioning. 11. The ego cannot withstand the conditioning process because the process itself demonstrates that there is another way. The classic conditioning by rewards model has always been most effective. Howard Hunt made a very good point in this connection, even though he did not understand that the real reason why conditioning through pain is not the most efficient method is because pain itself is an ego. an ego illusion. I'm going to repeat that. Howard Hunt made a very good point in this connection, even though he did not understand that the real reason why conditions through pain is not the most efficient method is because pain itself is an ego illusion and can never induce more than a temporary effect. 12. The rewards of God are immediately recognized as eternal. Since this recognition is made by you and not by your ego, the recognition itself establishes that you and your ego cannot be identical. You may believe that you already accept the difference, but you are by no means convinced as yet. The very fact that you are preoccupied with the idea of escaping from the ego shows this. 13. You cannot escape from your ego by humbling it or controlling it or punishing it. The ego and the spirit do not know each other. The spirit mind cannot maintain the separation except by dissociating. Having done this, it utilizes the repression against all truly natural impulses, not because the ego is a separate thing, but because you want to believe that you are. The ego is a device for maintaining this belief, but it is still only your willingness to use the device that enables it to endure. 14. My trust in you is greater than yours in me at the moment, but it will not always be that way. Your mission is very simple. You have been chosen to live so as to demonstrate that you are not an ego. I repeat that I do not choose God's channels wrongly. The only one, the Holy One shares my trust and always improves my atonement decisions because my will is never out of accord with His. Entonces la voluntad de Jesús y de su Padre nunca están en desacuerdo. 15. I have told you several times that I am in charge of the whole atonement. This is only because I completed my part in it as a man and can now complete it through others. My chosen receiving and sending channels cannot fail because I will lend them my strength as long as there is wanting. I will go with part in it as a man and can now complete it through others. My chosen receiving and sending channels cannot fail because I will lend them my strength as long as theirs is wanting. I will go with you to the Holy One, and through my perception, He can bridge the little gap. Your attitude to your brother is your only gift I want. I will bring it to God for you. Knowing that you know your brother is to know God. 16. A little knowledge is an all-encompassing thing. If you are grateful to your brother, you are grateful to God for what He created. Through your attitude, you can come to know your brother, and one moment of real recognition makes all men your brothers. All men are our brothers. Love does not conquer all things, but it does set all things right. Love does not conquer all things, but it does set things right, quote unquote. 17. Because you are all the kingdom of God, I can lead you back to your creations which you do not yet know. God has kept them very safe in His knowing, while your attention has wandered. What has been dissociated is still here. Wisdom always dictates through weaker defenses first. Even though dissociation is much more apparent in some and repression is much more evident in others, each person utilizes both. For those whose major ego defense is dissociation, I suggest that they deal with repression first. We have only just about reached the point where dissociation may mean much to learn, because it is so important to their misbeliefs. Dissociation is so extreme in their case that they have learned that they have not had to hide it because they have not been aware that it is. It is there. They will eventually experience things that will cut across other perceptions because of their stunning knowledge. This will occur when they learn to recognize what they already know and have dissociated. 19. Others might do well to concentrate more on the dissociative tendencies and not try to deal with repression yet. Disengagement, distanciation, and detachment are all forms of dissociation. And these weaker forms are more evident in these individuals. They do dissociate more than they think. And that, for instance, is why they have difficulty with listening. They will give up their major ego defense after they have rid themselves of the lesser ones. 20. To them I say, do not disturb yourself about repression, but do train yourself to be alert to any tendency to withdraw from your brothers. Withdrawal is frightening, and you do not recognize all the forms it takes in you. You are afraid of all complete involvements and believe that they lessen you. You may have already learned to be more clear-sighted about this, in which case you should be already in opposite in your it. Wait a minute. You may have already learned to be more clear-sighted about this, in which case you should be ready to oppose it in yourself relatively easily. As you come closer to a brother, you do approach me, and as you withdraw from him, I become distant to you. 21. A giant step forward is, in your case, would be to insist in a collaborative venture. This does not go against the true spirit of meditation at all. It is inherent in it. Meditation is a collaborative venture with God. It cannot be undertaken successfully by those who disengage themselves from the sonship because they are disengaging themselves from me. God will come to you only as you will give him to your brothers. Learn first of them, and you will be ready to hear God as you hear them. That is because the function of love is one. 22. How can you teach someone the value of something he has thrown away deliberately? He must have thrown it away because he did not value it. You can only show him how miserable he is without it and bring it near very slowly so he can learn how his misery lessens as he approaches it. This conditions him to associate his misery with its absence and to associate the opposite of misery with its presence. It gradually becomes desirable as he changes his mind about its worth. 23. I am conditioning you to associate misery with the ego and joy with your spirit. You have conditioned yourself the other way around, but a far greater reward will break through any conditioning if that reward is repeatedly offered when the old habit is broken. You are still free to choose, but can you really want the rewards of the ego in the presence of the rewards of God? Y aquí voy a hacer una pausa y voy a volver en un instante a partir del epígrafe 9. Me faltaría 9, 10 y 11. Permítaseme mirar por este tiempo que aún dispongo. Si me esperan un segundo, únicamente deseo tomar un poquito de agua y así no interrumpo la transmisión. 9. Asking, thank you for waiting, thank you for the wait. Asking and following, preguntando y siguiendo, pidiendo guía y siguiendo la guía sería. Asking and following. If you have a fear reaction in meditation, the reason may be that you have not yet been able to suspend judgment and have merely succeeded in weakening your control over it. Since you have an unfortunate tendency to be self-punishing, you believe that control of judgment is a self-preserving function and therefore regarded as a necessary defense of yourself. Weakening this defense deliberately is thus perceived as dangerous vulnerability which frightens you. 2. If you are having this reaction, then you should ask before attempting meditation again. It would be very unwise to try before we can do it together. I assure you I will be vigilant in identifying the right time. I cannot tell you when that will be, because I do not know. You will tell me that, but may not recognize that you have done so. That is why you need me to relay your own message back to you. When we are both ready, it cannot be fearful. 3. If you wonder why you have difficulty in communicating with me, I ask you to please listen very carefully to these remarks. 4. If you ask me for guidance, you have signified your willingness to give over your own control, at least to some extent. Your frequent failure to ask at all indicates that at such times you are not willing to go even that far. Failure to ask for guidance is a sign of fear. But when you at least ask, you are acting on a cooperative thought, even though it may not lack ambivalence. You are therefore entitled to a specific answer, but unless you follow it without judging it, you will become defensive about the next step which you will take. 5. You should be confident that any guidance which comes from me will not jeopardize anyone. If you can continue not to evaluate my messages and merely follow them, they will lead to good for everyone. Since this is the same area of difficulty which may be causing your trouble with meditation, practice in this is essential. I do not yet know what decisions those who are involved in what is happening today will make, but I assure you with the confidence I urge you to share that whatever they may be can be utilized for good if you will let them be. Why not unburden yourself of the kind of responsibility which you cannot meet? And devote yourself in peace to the many others which you can discharge without strain. 7. It is your responsibility to recognize the difference. Any confusion in this respect is arrogance. There are miracles that should be offered to particular people today, and I will tell you specifically, in answer to your asking who those people are. Miracles are urgently needed for you, although this is not the spirit in which you must undertake them. You have hurt yourself and need healing. It does not matter whether the people you think have hurt you have really thought hurtfully. You have. You must undo this, and your attempt will surely be blessed. 8. If you will to help your brother overcome his negative emotions, which are totally unjustified in spite of your misperception, you will not only help him, but enable both of us to help you. This will institute the chain of helpfulness and harmlessness, which always leads to the atonement and becomes a powerful part of its beneficence. 9. While not asking for guidance is a mistake, evaluating what you hear in terms of your own convenience is another mistake. You often see only one alternative and are unable to keep an open mind. You do not take alternate possibilities into account, which is a major problem. You should also train yourself to learn that alternate possibilities are better not left up to you. Whenever you react as though they are, I am sorry, you will have trouble. If you ask what to do and are willing to forgo control of the decision, whatever you do will be only benign. Could we continue in that spirit? I offer far more than partial guidance. Although you do not ask for more, the uneven quality of your skill in both asking and following my direction is due to the alternations you experience between ego and miracle-oriented perception. This is a strain, but fortunately one which can be overcome along with the rest. There will never be a time when I do not will to try again. You might be gladdened by remembering that. Section 10. Complete and direct communication. It should be clear that while the content of any particular ego illusion does not matter, it is usually more helpful to correct it in a specific context. You are often too abstract in this matter. Ego illusions are quite specific, although they frequently change. And although the mind is naturally abstract, it became concrete voluntarily as soon as it split. However, only part of it split, so only part of it is concrete. Thank goodness. 2. The concrete part is the same part that believes in the ego, because the ego depends on the specific. It is the part that believes your existence means you are separate. Everything the ego perceives is a separate whole, without the relationships that imply being. The ego is thus against communication, except insofar as it is utilized to establish separateness rather than to abolish it. 3. The communication system of the ego is based on its own thought system and is everything else it dictates. Its communication is controlled by its need to protect itself, and it will disrupt communication when it experiences threat. While this is always so, individual egos perceive different kinds of threat, which are quite specific in their own judgment. For example, although all forms of perceived demand may be classified not or judged by the ego as coercive communication which must be disrupted, the response of breaking communication will nevertheless be to a specific person or persons. 4. The specificity of the ego's thinking then results in a spurious kind of generalization, which is really not abstract at all. It will respond in certain specific ways to all stimuli with it, which it perceives as related. In contrast, the spirit reacts in the same way to everything it knows is true and does not respond at all to anything else. Nor does it make any attempts to establish what is true. It knows that what is true is everything that God created. It is in complete and direct communication with every aspect of creation because it is in complete and direct communication with its creator. 5. The communication is the will of God. Creation and communication are synonymous. God created every mind by communicating his mind to it, thus establishing it forever as a channel for the reception of his mind and will. Since only beings of a like order can truly communicate, his creations naturally communicate with him and communicate like him. This communication is perfectly abstract in that its quality is universal in application and not subject to any judgment, any exception, or any alteration. God created you by this and for this. The mind can distort its functions, but it cannot endow itself with those it was not given. That is why the mind cannot totally lose the ability to communicate, even though it may refuse to stabilize it on behalf of being. 6. Existence as well as being rests on communication. Existence is specific in how, what, and with whom communication is considered worth undertaking. Being is completely without these distinctions. It is a state in which the mind is in communication with everything that is real, including its own spirit. To whatever extent you permit this state to be curtailed, you are limiting your sense of your own reality, which becomes total only by recognizing all reality in the glorious context of its real relationship to you. This is your reality. Do not desecrate it or recoil from it. It is your real home, your real temple, and your real self. 7. God, who encompasses all being, nevertheless created distinct beings who have everything individually, but who want to share it to increase their joy. Nothing that is real can be increased except by sharing it. That is why God Himself created you. Divine abstraction takes joy in application. And this is what creation means. How, what, and to whom are irrelevant, because real creation gives everything since it can only create like itself. Remember that in being, there is no difference between having and being, as there is in existence. In the state of being, the mind gives everything always. 8. The Bible repeatedly states that you should praise God. This hardly means that you should tell Him how wonderful He is. He has no ego with which to accept such things and no perceptions with which to judge your offerings. But unless you take your part in the creation, His joy is not complete because yours is not complete. And this He knows, He does know. He knows it in His own being and its experience of His Son's experience. The constant going out of His love is blocked when His channels are closed, and He is lowly when the minds He created do not communicate fully with Him. 9. God has kept your kingdom for you, but He cannot share His joy with you until you know it with your whole mind. Even revelation is not enough because it is communication with God, but it is not enough unless it is shared. God does not need revaluation returned to Him, which would clearly be impossible, but He does want revelation brought to others. This cannot be done with the actual revelation because its content cannot be expressed and is intensely personal to the mind which receives it. But it can still be returned by that mind to other minds through the attitudes which the knowledge from the revelation brings. Paragraph 10. God is praised whenever any mind learns to be wholly helpful. This is impossible without being wholly harmless, because the two beliefs must coexist. The truly helpful are invulnerable because they are not protecting their egos, so that nothing can hurt them. Their helpfulness is the praise of God. Their helpfulness is their praise of God, and He will return their praise of Him, because they are like Him and can rejoice together. God does out of them. God goes out to them and through them, and there is great joy throughout the kingdom. Every mind that is changed adds to this joy with its own individual willingness to share in it. End of section 10, now section 11. Being truly helpful. Oh, here is the prayer, I guess. Being truly helpful. The truly helpful are God's miracle workers, whom I direct until we are all united in the joy of the kingdom. I will direct you to wherever you can be truly helpful, and to whoever can follow my guidance through you. 2. Regarding the field of rehabilitation, properly speaking, every mind which is split needs rehabilitation. The medical orientation emphasizes the body, and the vocational orientation stresses the ego. The team approach generally leads more to confusion than anything else because it is too often misused as an experience for sharing the ego's dominion with other egos, rather than as a real experiment in cooperation of minds. 3. The reason why you should learn to offer rehabilitation is because you need rehabilitation yourself. So often have I answered, help your brother when you've asked me to help you. He too has asked for help, and he has been helped whenever he was truly helpful to you. He has also gained to whatever extent he could give. Four, rehabilitation is a social movement. Rehabilitation as a social movement has been an improvement over overt neglect, but it is often little more than a painful attempt on the part of the halt to lead the blind. This can be seen easily enough, but it is not what you need to look at. You have a fear of broken bodies because your ego cannot tolerate them. Your ego cannot tolerate ego weakness either without ambivalence because it is afraid of its own weakness and the weakness of its chosen home. 5. That is really why you recoil from the demands of the dependent and from the sight of a broken body. Your ego is threatened and blocks your natural impulse to help, placing you under the strain of divided will. You withdraw to allow your ego to recover and to regain enough strength to be helpful again on a basis limited enough not to threaten your ego, but also too limited to give you joy. 6. Those with broken bodies are often looked down on by the ego because of its belief that nothing but a perfect body is worthy as its own temple. A mind that recoils from a hurt body is in great need of rehabilitation itself. A damaged brain is also hardly a danger. All symptoms of hurt need true helpfulness, and whenever they are met with us, the mind that so meets them heals itself. 7. Rehabilitation is an attitude of praising God as He Himself knows praise. He offers praise to you, and you must offer it to others. The real limitations on clinical psychology, as it is evaluated by its followers, at present are not reflected by the attitudes of psychologists or medical boards or hospital administrators, even though most of them are sadly in need of rehabilitation themselves. The real handicaps of the clinicians lie in their nature, in their attitudes to those whom their ego perceive as weakened and damaged. By these evaluations, they have weakened and damaged their own helpfulness and have thus set their own rehabilitation back. Rehabilitation is not concerned with the ego's flight for control, nor the ego's need to avoid and withdraw. 8. You can do much on behalf of your own rehabilitation and your brothers, and much more universally as well, if you think of situations calling for your help in this way. The prayer. I am here only to be truly helpful. I am here to represent Him who sent me. I do not have to worry about what to say or what to do because He who sent me will direct me. I am content to be wherever He wishes, knowing He goes there with me. I will be healed as I let Him teach me to heal. End of chapter 4. Thank you. So the last section of chapter 4 is where I could find the prayer. Gratitud, infinita filiación. Este aspecto de la mente ha estado perdonando ideas de cansancio, de incomodidad, porque tengo claro que el ego quiere preservarse a sí mismo. Este mismo capítulo se trataba de eso. Y mantenerlo a él, calma, 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 quédate ahí mientras yo estudio. No lo puedo lograr sola, sino siempre de la mano del Espíritu Santo. Gratitud por todo. Nos vemos el día de mañana con el capítulo 5. El capítulo 5 se intitula, a ver aquí, The Holy Spirit, el Espíritu Santo. El capítulo 5 se denomina el Espíritu Santo. Hasta el ilusorio día de mañana.